Welcome to Et Al, a podcast from Baylor University Press, where we interview authors and publishing experts to bring you the best scholarship in the fields of scriptural, historical, and theological studies, as well as the world of academic publishing. Thanks for joining us.
Welcome, everyone, to Et Al, a podcast of Baylor University Press. We are joined today by our very own Reverend Dr. Chris Seitz. Chris has written many books with us, but most recently he has written The Predestinate, Ecclesiastes, and The Man Who Outshone the Sun King. So we're here today to talk about the latest from him. Chris, for our audience members who might not know you or your work, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit and explain how you ended up coming out with this book?
I teach graduate students at the University of Toronto at Wycliffe College, and I'm in Old Testament, but I also, I've written a commentary in New Testament, and I am interested in the history of biblical interpretation, which is so-called pre-modern interpretation. And this book leans into that a little bit because the figure under discussion, Nicolas Fouquet, is someone I discovered in the history of interpretation. So that is to say, in the 16th century, there was attributed to this gentleman a collection of Solomon's works, that is his sentence wisdom, and it was a bestseller. And I was curious about why that was so.
Okay. Yeah, so this is a book that is dealing quite extensively with Ecclesiastes as a book in terms of its, and specifically the question of authorship is a key question. So how does Fouquet play into that as a kind of, how are you deploying that in this?
Fouquet would likely be a household name among intelligent people in France. He would not be known here. There's only one English biography of him called The Man Who Outshone the Sun King, which is the subtitle of this book, and the author of that book and I are colleagues, and I have spoken with him. Fouquet would be known in France for a chateau that he built, which is about 30 miles south of Paris. So in a good location for such a thing. And the reason it's close to Paris is that he was quite a high civil figure. He was the superintendent of finances, which in our lexicon would be something like Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of State, all rolled into one.
Yeah.
He was the most influential man. I think at one point I say Rothschild, Rockefeller, Ben Franklin, all rolled into one.
Okay.
Because he was a patron of the arts. He was an extremely classy man, an extremely competent man. In the 16th century, Louis XIV is well known, the Sun King, and absolute monarchy, and he ruled for a long time.
Yep.
I think Queen Elizabeth beat him by a week or something like that. Because he was in his minority, his father and mother had him later in life, so he was a young boy, and he came into his majority when Fouquet was already well established in France.
Okay.
And at the time, the ability to raise taxes was an art form, and Fouquet was very good at it because you couldn't just strong-arm people or you wouldn't get anything. And so he was an extraordinarily successful superintendent of finances. And in this era, you didn't have a central bank. Mm-hmm. It was hard to know how to pay yourself. Cardinal Richelieu was the cardinal at the time, and Louis XIII really wasn't very much on the scene. And in this power vacuum, Fouquet became quite powerful and amassed a lot of wealth. And he built a chateau, and it was the most magnificent chateau in France. Its scale is not, it's not like Amboise. It's not like the big chateaus in the Loire Valley, but it's a private residence. Mm-hmm. So most people in France would know him for that accomplishment, as would tourists from the United States. It would be, to my mind, it would be more interesting to visit than Versailles. So
Really? Okay.
Now that Versailles is elaborate, grand, and by some accounts, Louis XIV built Versailles out of revenge. Okay. So the team that Fouquet assembled to build Vaux-le-Vicomte is called, he stole after he imprisoned Fouquet and built Versailles.
Okay.
And part of it was that Louis XIV wanted to get out of Paris. It's a little dangerous. There's a lot of poisoning and that kind of thing. But also, he was Louis XIV, and he wanted to build the biggest, most, to my mind, rather garish chateau. So most people would know him for that reason. Louis XIV was in Fontainebleau, south of Vaux, which was the traditional chateau of kings in France. And Fouquet invited him to come to the chateau that he had built. And he was charged with embezzlement and charged with insubordination, lèse-majesté. And he was, after a 3-year trial, was in prison for life. And most people would know that about him. He was a figure of some sympathy, the victim of absolute monarchy.
Yeah.
Voltaire wrote a biography of Louis XIV in which he, took after Louis XIV. He was imprisoned himself for that. But Fouquet was sent off. Louis XIV wanted to execute him. The judges wanted him to be banished, exiled. It's that kind of thing happened. And they went down the middle and imprisoned him. And there were royal prisons in France. He was in Pignerol, which today is in Italy. What the viewers would know a bit is that by stroke of providence or whatever, the Three Musketeers, the Musketeers is a reality.
Okay.
And the head of the Three Musketeers was Fouquet's personal guard during his trial, and they became friends. And so he was a very prominent figure. And when he was in prison, his valet, at the end of his life, he was there for 18 years, 16 in Pignerol and 2 more prior to that. His valet was the Man in the Iron Mask.
Okay.
Now, Alexandre Dumas, who made these figures popular, was much later, and he romanticized them, and it was the whopping bestsellers, Three Musketeers, Count of Monte Cristo, and so forth. Unfortunately, Fouquet died in prison, though Louis XIV wanted to free him. He was 65, and it was a terrible place to be. It was in the Alps. It was cold. So that's who Fouquet is, as the public would generally know about him.
Yeah.
Ironically, if you ask a French person, where is Fouquet buried, they may not know, because part of the point of the book, he's buried in Paris, in the Marais, in a district of Paris, in what is now a Protestant church, and he's in the crypt with all his family. But if you are charged with the crimes he was charged with, they took your name away.
Right. Okay.
And so most people don't know he's even there. And when I went to see it, I talk about it in the book. The Protestant church that's there now doesn't know its own history because it goes back before the Revolution. And I said, well, I'd like to see the crypt of Nicolas Fouquet. And they said, we don't know who he is.
Wow. Yeah.
It's like, well, this is like a major figure. There's a historical plaque out front. And his mother was a religious woman, quite prominent in court. So she knew Anne of Austria, who was the mother of Louis XIV. And so Fouquet was from a very prominent family, very religious. I think is important to say. His mother, all of her children went into religious life. Fouquet started off in religious life, and Cardinal Richelieu said, you're very good at politics and money and so forth, so don't do that. So he left the order and he became...
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, what a trajectory to go from having the king over to your newly built, magnificent home in the countryside to literally dying namelessly. But you have this parallel between what's happening there and what's happening in Ecclesiastes. So could you talk a little bit about that connection?
Yeah. There are all kinds of convergences that are intriguing. The book tries to draw them out, losing your name and so forth. In early rabbinic accounts of Ecclesiastes, they made note of the fact that Solomon, who appears to be the figure depicted in the autobiographical beginning of the book, I mean, pretty obvious that that's who it is never named. And this is a puzzle. I mean, Song of Songs says the Song of Solomon's, Proverbs say the Proverbs of Solomon. Ecclesiastes prefers to work with this rather obscure figure, Kohelet in Hebrew, Luther translated the prediger, the preacher. Kahal, to organize or gather together an assembly. Luther took that to mean to convene a church or to be a preacher.
Yeah.
And Ecclesiastes has some of that feel, ecclesia. And the rabbis said, well, early rabbinic tradition said, well, this is a story about Solomon seen from the standpoint of the last chapters written about him in Kings, where his wives seduced him to worship false gods. And I mean, this is in the biblical record, and he fell out of favor with God and so forth. He committed idolatry. And the opening of the book shows Solomon worshiping, and his wives are behind him in this sort of obscure way. This is a super painting, by the way. I found this. It was hard to find a really good one. And they said, well, so there's a midrash. There's a sort of story that tries to explain this, and it says, I, Solomon, was once king over Israel in Jerusalem, and that's a line out of Ecclesiastes. And I'm just paraphrasing. And I lost the plot. I worshiped false gods, and I had my name taken away. And I wandered the streets saying, I am Koheleth, and my signet ring God took from me, and so forth. Now that suggests a couple things. One, that from the standpoint of the earliest reception history of the book, they made note of the fact that Solomon wasn't named, but they assumed that this could be explained by the fact that in chapter 11 of 1 Kings, he had lost his name, and this happened because of this precipitous fall akin to Fouquet. So that's partly where I got that idea. But also in Ecclesiastes, you get a clear sense in the autobiographical part at the beginning of the book that he himself is saying that he did all these things, and they proved to be Hevel.
Yes. Yeah.
And so I was seeing these parallels, and Fouquet lost his name, but also Fouquet, a volume appeared, the collection of the sayings of Solomon, and also Ben Sira, Deuterocanonical book, attributed to him. And so there were these little associations floating around that intrigued me. Why did this book circulate by Fouquet when he was in prison? He couldn't write. I mean, so the research is such that we now know certain things that the general public at the time didn't know. So the general public thought that Fouquet in prison was writing this penitential account of himself. But we now know who the author is. That I deal with it in the book. But it was this has to do too with something that does intrigue me, and that is why it is before rapid book sales, like Baylor Press trying to sell books rapidly,
and as many as possible.
In the era in which we're talking about copywriting, royalties, all that, it's in a fledgling kind of stage. So often what would happen is that religious people, Jesuits and others, would write these things. And in this case, it's a collection of the sayings of Solomon, so it's already there. And then write meditations and spiritual guidance and stuff. And they couldn't make any money, and so they circulated the work under someone who was well known.
Oh, interesting.
And it's not all that unusual. They're spiritual classics from the same era that are attributed to famous people, and people say, "Oh, that's Father Lecas," and that kind of thing. It turns out the circle that he was giving spiritual direction to were actually the authors of the material, but they felt as though he was the source of the spiritual wisdom that they were getting.
Right.
And it just shows that authorship is an interesting concept. Today, I write a book, I want a royalty, and my name's on the spine. That wasn't always so. And it'll take a while for that idea to catch hold. It has to do with book production and so forth. So not only did Fouquet fall dramatically, so too did Ecclesiastes. And so I was intrigued with that fact, and that this work had circulated under his name in the same way that a work circulated under Solomon's name.
Yes.
Or so it seems. You see, it's that kind of thing.
Right. Yeah. So even though the sayings of Solomon, and no, it doesn't explicitly claim to be written
By
by
Solomon.
Fouquet.
Oh, exactly. No,
Right.
what he did, it's interesting. There's no cover. There's no author on the spine. The production is a Paris publisher. It's just blank. But at the beginning, there's a little, it starts off in this spirit. Here I am in exile, in prison. I'm paraphrasing. Don't feel sorry for me, dear Theotemus. It's sort of like Theophilus in Luke. It's an apostrophe to the one who fears God.
Yes.
Don't worry about me. I appreciate your prayers and kindness, but I am in the company of someone that is extraordinarily helpful to me, and I thank God for it, and it's Solomon. And so the general public assumed it was Fouquet.
Right.
And so when it came out, everyone assumed it was, and it became a bestseller, presumably because it was of spiritual value, but also because Fouquet would become a symbol of what it meant to push back against absolute monarchy.
Yeah.
And there was a similar tension in England at the time. In the book, I allow myself scope to look at one of the earliest English translations of the book, and Fouquet figures quite predominantly. The assumption is that it was Fouquet. Fouquet is well known. And that's the starting point for the translation.
Yeah,
we can learn from this man and so forth. So a poor guy got run over by kings and so forth. So
yeah, so you've got these two men who are both have these elaborate lifestyles, in some ways, incredibly successful lives. They reach a point of ruin in some sense, and then they kind of historically, or at least in the minds of most people, sort of drop off the record. But then there are these works produced, not quite in their name, but almost.
Yeah, and I think we're meant to, it's like if you've got a different account of authorship. I mean, you could raise this about any biblical book. Paul dictated letters. I mean, the idea of authorship in modernity is, I'm the author. I typed it in and gave the manuscript to Baylor. They published it. It's really not the way authorship worked in antiquity. Even in Proverbs, anybody reading the book knows you get toward the end of the book and it says this is the wisdom of the men of Hezekiah and stuff like that. So Solomon is taken to be a kind of, as law came from Moses, wisdom came from Solomon. It's just anything. Ben Sira is a 2nd century BC Jewish wisdom book, and it's kind of loosely associated with Solomon. He's been dead forever. In the case of Fouquet, the other interesting thing that we don't have, because it's in our era more, 16th century, we have the writings that Fouquet produced in prison. And so I need to bring that in, because while now we know who compiled the Counsels of Wisdom is the name of the book. We can now see what the mindset was of Fouquet, because the archives that came out later from his time in prison show his mental and spiritual state. And he is in this period of contrition, very much like unto Solomon, both in Ecclesiastes and both in what we would assume would be an account of him that was taking into account his idolatry and his falling away from God. Fouquet, in his own way, says as much. He's translating from Latin into French the psalms that are royal psalms, because he's discovered the real king is not Louis XIV. The real king is God, and they're quite moving. I mean, they're so for me, this is a fascinating example of both a sense of convergence between these two works, but also little clues as to how authorship functioned.
And that is a consistent theme that you're driving at, is this question of how do we conceive of authorship, and what does that mean for the way that these texts are received, right? So what are some of the dilemmas regarding authorship when it comes to Ecclesiastes in particular?
Yeah, I don't. It's an interesting topic. Again, I would say that with the rise of historical biblical criticism, the search for an author was motivated not so much in Luther and Calvin. They had just generic ideas, and they weren't high flying.
Right.
If you said to Calvin, "Did Moses write the Pentateuch?" He would have said, "Yes, he did." Well, how did he do it? He would have said, "That's an impertinent question." Those weren't questions that they were trying to answer on the terms of our present inquiries into these books. And in the 18th century, there were efforts to dispute the Solomonic authorship of Ecclesiastes on the grounds that the Hebrew found in the book was not Hebrew from the period of Solomon. So we're getting now a taxonomy of the Hebrew language that the pre-critical readers weren't operating with. And then you have this kind of fight between those who are saying it has to be Solomon's or it's not authentic, that kind of thing. Or if he didn't write it, who did? But these questions, they're peculiar to a certain period in time. I think that the interest in the literal sense at the time of the Reformation turned on wanting the biblical text to function in clear ways without a lot of spiritual glossing and so forth. And so the turn toward intentionality carried with it also an interest in the human author. Mm-hmm. And this debate got ramped up, I would say, in ways that are kind of artificial to the intention of the work itself. And here, it strikes me that the early interpreters, if you ask them who wrote Ecclesiastes, their answer would be quite clear. God did. In other words, this question isn't operating in the same way.
Right. Yeah. So in some ways, the problem is not so much in the answers that are being given here, but in the actual question itself is not native to the text. And
I think that's right. And I can't remember who I cited, Didymus the Blind, I think it is, or one of the early church fathers said, well, if it was written by Solomon, then its bandwidth would be narrowly focused just on him, and it really wouldn't have anything to say to us. We'd simply say, well, I'm not a king,
Yeah.
And so the hermeneutics implied by, I would say, my brother once said this to me, what you're saying basically is that Solomon didn't write Ecclesiastes, he inspired it. Mm-hmm. And it's not a bad shorthand.
Yeah.
He inspired it. We are meant, in my view, and this cuts against the grain of much modern biblical scholarship, we are to think of the persona active in the book as Solomon. We are to think along those lines. Most modern treatments of the book just separate him from Solomon and say this is a piece of wisdom literature. It belongs in a certain sort of understanding of the evolution of wisdom from practical empiricism. Stitch in time saves 9. Don't stand up and talk in front of the king. Proverbs, to Job, to Ecclesiastes, where there's a kind of pessimism. And I just found that interpretation of the book foreign to the intention of the book. And here I found Fouquet helpful because I say this in the chapters where I'm dealing with Ecclesiastes, I call Ecclesiastes Koheles Solomonic confession or meditation. I think we're not to think of it as Solomon's, but Koheles, but it's Solomonic in spirit.
Yeah.
It's evoking him, and it's a meditation or a confession, sort of torn between those two topics, because the author is looking back over his life and is confessing so in the autobiographical part, for example, he says, I built gardens, I did this, and so forth and so on. And look, and behold, it was hevel, it was vanity. And it's been pointed out that the analogy is in Genesis 1, where God creates and he says, and look, and I beheld, and it was good. So Solomon has usurped the role of God and made himself God, and he's discovered in the course of doing so, in his accumulation
Yeah.
and so forth, that it's vanity. It's a chasing after wind. And so I think we are meant to imagine Solomon in the role because it fits. It fits a lifestyle where, due to surplus of goods and things, he became idolatrous, basically.
And your interpretation of Ecclesiastes, I found really interesting in that it doesn't sort of end at everything is vanity, but that you think that the work as a whole is pointing in a much more hopeful direction. Could you kind of unpack that for us a little bit?
Yeah, I think that's why it's kind of I think we need to think of the author as old. And I think the end of the book is his funeral account, chapter 12, and I don't think that's overly controversial. The grinders are few, and so forth. My teeth are falling out, and I'm scared at night, and so forth and so on.
Yeah,
it's a sort of a farewell. Beware, my son. Beyond these, be careful. These are the sayings. They're like goads firmly fixed. But I think that what we're observing, and one of the ways I get at this, or I try to, is there's some controversy over the poem at the beginning of the book, where it says the waters flow and so forth, and then it says all is vanity. In my view, and I agree with Van Leuven here and others, what the opening poem is, which is a threshold, it's a kind of prologue to the book. Because Solomon doesn't step, or the figure, Koheleth, doesn't step onto the scene until after that poem. Yeah. And in that poem, in my view, what's being said is that God has so ordered the creation that it moves organically. Rivers don't overflow. They come back to themselves. The wind doesn't blow itself out. But over against that is human comprehension, which is limited, words, memory. And what they set that up, and then you see Solomon break the rules. Koheleth, he basically steps out of the bounded goodness of God's created order, and in so doing is now confessing that it was a mistake.
Yeah.
So it's hopeful in the sense that it's warning us about the lessons that Koheleth has learned. And of course, you also have the refrains of the book that speak of, be mindful then of love and of the enjoyment of the creation according to God's purposes. And I should say this too. I started off on this quest in part, and I say it in the book, because the way Ecclesiastes is presented typically is pessimism.
Yeah.
And this gets at the question about Hevel. If you translate Hevel as absurdity, it seems to me that one of the things you're doing is you're pressing very hard on the notes of modernity, and you're blaming the created order and God himself for the state of affairs in which we live. The world's absurd.
Yeah.
Futile. Now, ephemerality, there are all kinds of possibilities here. Hevel is basically exhale. I mean, it's the word for breathing. It's non-productive. It's CO2 in some measure. Now, if you translate it ungraspable, it seems to me that one of the things you're headed toward is that the problem of the created order is in us. We're unable to live within its limits. And when we don't, we're trying to outdistance a bounded created order in which we live. And death being the final boundary. And I was intrigued because when I was working with Childs, I was teaching Koheleth as in my first teaching job to divinity students, seminarians, Lutheran seminarians. And I was using Childs' textbook because it seemed to me a useful way to pay attention to the full contents of books, because he was mapping this out in the way that he did. And he said about Ecclesiastes that it was the most turned to spiritual guide in the history of the tradition. And I thought, oh wow, well, that's completely at odds.
Yeah, right.
That something's wrong with us. Something's gone off the rails. It's the skull on the desk.
Yeah.
It was taken to be the book that taught us how to grow old and be wise by paying attention to the limits of life, including our own death.
Yeah.
And that's the way it had been taken. And it wasn't pessimistic. So by getting Fouquet in place, I was trying to set up conditions where you have an elderly man who's learned his lessons, and that's the way we ought to think about Ecclesiastes as
Yes.
well.
Okay. So you bring up that you want to translate hevel instead of vanity or meaningless, as ungraspable. So there's something about that kind of recognition of our locatedness and our limits, as you've said. That feels very much like the end of Job, perhaps, as well, which you've also written on quite extensively.
Yeah, I think, I'd be cautious here. I can't remember who said this one time. He said, well, actually, you shouldn't translate it at all. You should just leave it hevel. Well, but the point there being is you can discover the word by seeing how it functions rather than preempting it by giving it a meaning. Sure. And I think hevel's a kind of word which also has some scope and range in the book itself. I don't think ungraspable will work all the time, but I think it's closest to what I think is the author has in mind. Some people think there's a word play on the Hebrew name avail, able, here today, gone tomorrow.
Right. Oh, interesting. Yeah.
That could be right. It's kind of hard to know how to classify this. It's a key word.
Yeah.
That's quite elusive. Chasing after wind, gets that, that gets that ungraspable. Wind, God has ordered wind so that he makes it go where it will, but we don't know it. The New Testament says the same thing.
Yeah.
The wind blows where it wills, and you do not hear the sound of it. I think there's something going on there, which is why I would prefer that. But I would be firmer in rejecting futility, absurdity.
Yeah.
Because it sounds a little like Jean-Paul Sartre or something like that.
Right.
The world's a mess and we're in it. And a lot of, I think that's Crenshaw's reading of the book, for example, of Blessed Memory.
Yeah. And so you mentioned Childs, and you were a student of Brevard Childs, and you have an extensive discussion of the canonical interpretation and how that might come to bear on this. Could you unpack a little bit of that there?
Yeah. The way I deploy this in the book is to say a canonical reading pays attention to the form of a book. And in a case like Koheleth, Ecclesiastes, there's clearly a beginning and an ending, and these ought to guide us to what's going on in the middle. You don't take the epilogue off.
Yeah.
As is often the case. Here's a guy trying to tidy up a hard message by saying, be good now.
Yes.
Don't do that. And the opening poem gives us a kind of vision about the way the world looks to God, and then shows us Koheleth departing from that in the Solomon-like role.
Right.
So at a low-flying level, plus most people have noticed, this is not all that controversial, though, what one makes of it. The middle point of the book of Ecclesiastes is a divider between the first half of the book focuses on acknowledging limits, and the second part is more a matter of mystery. Who knows is the question being posed often. And learning to live with mystery is also a part of spiritual maturity. So first you learn about limitation in the first half of the book, and secondly you learn about mystery. Bent things can't be made straight. Now that's a limitation because God's ordered them to be in this form, and if you try to change it, that you break them. So the first part is about boundedness in the created order.
Yeah.
The second one is about things we just don't know, we can't understand, the flight of birds and this kind of thing. And there's a lot of similarity there to Job. It seems to me that what Job is learning is that the created order is God's fingerprint, and in that sense, it belongs to Him. And in some ways, it's not easy to understand.
Yeah.
Why do ostriches lay their eggs and step on them? That kind of thing. And so, at one level, the argument simply has to do with the paying attention to the form and resisting efforts to extract things. Now, that tends to be a trend in modern Ecclesiastes studies as well. Very few commentators today, Craig Bartholomew, Tremper Longman, believe that the way you understand the book is to take these things out and leave those things behind.
Yeah.
And that had been tried. So in that sense, it's a canonical reading. It pays attention to the final form. Just as there is a beginning of wisdom in Proverbs, so there is an end of wisdom in Ecclesiastes. There's a kind of bookend there.
Yeah.
It belongs to the Solomon corpus and oughtn't to be taken away and put in another context in which Job suddenly appears. So you got Proverbs, you got Job, it's got a halfway point between pessimism and conventional wisdom. Then you have Ecclesiastes. No, we keep the book in the Solomonic orbit, but then we try to understand what kind of Solomon we're talking about.
Yeah.
And in chapter 7, I'm dealing with a slightly different question. That'll be the most difficult section of the book to read for a non-specialist, because I'm dealing with why Childs was interested in the history of interpretation in his Exodus commentary. And the person I'm talking to here is Stuart Weeks, who's trying to separate the book of Ecclesiastes from Solomon. And it would be my view that to do that is, even in the terms I'm using it, and Solomonic authorship, I think, is a modern idea. I don't think it belongs to the history of interpretation. But to take the book and remove any Solomonic background noise, or what you want to call it, is a mistake, in my view. And that's what he was trying to do. And I think here the question I would raise has to do with the role of the history of interpretation. And that is that Ecclesiastes exists as a work, but it also exists in a community who treasure it and read it in a certain kind of way. And I don't think you can just pare all that back. I think you have to pay attention to it. Childs likens the history of interpretation after the text is formed to its prehistory. And I've not really thought about that a lot, and I don't think a lot of people have. There's a lot of questions raised. Well, why are you doing history of interpretation of Exodus? You got all this investment in the pre-critical, in the prehistory of the text. Why are we looking at the reception history? He said, well, they're actually a little bit alike. We read the history of interpretation in order to see how the church heard a work, or the synagogue, and then measure it against what we think the book is doing and test it, rather than just discounting it entirely. These early rabbinic accounts that are trying to make sense of why Solomon's not named, they're really quite rich. In my view, I think they're catching something.
So there you have the reception history of Ecclesiastes, but then you also have the reception history of Solomon as a figure, and that then paralleling the reception history of Fouquet, as a figure, right? So could you talk a little bit about how his life becomes emblematic and embraced in this sort of way in which the community is now gathering around and using his life as a means of interpreting wisdom as a whole?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I said something about this earlier because I look at the earliest reception history of which exists in the translations of the Councils of Wisdom. Les Conseils de la Sagesse appeared in the 16th century, and is immediately, and it was Stuart Weeks actually who I think put me onto this in this article where he's trying to separate the two. He said that, and I had to go do a lot of research on this, that this book had been a whopping bestseller, and it got translated immediately into all these languages. And I thought, well, what's going on there? Why did that happen? And my initial hunch was that you could use the Councils of Wisdom. It's a big book. I mean, it's 400 pages. You could use it to raise your children or something like that. It's like, here's rules for proper conduct at court or something. And then I realized I was wrong about that I didn't know anything about the Fouquet connection. And so when I saw the Fouquet connection, and then I began to look at the reception history of the Councils of Wisdom in their translated form, they didn't just translate this little prologue that says, I'm sitting here in exile and I'm in the company of Solomon and all that. They often have a long, in the one case I look at, a fairly long treatment of the effect of reading the Councils of Wisdom as if they were written by Fouquet. Because Fouquet has become a famous figure in his death. And as I said, in England, they're also wrestling with absolute monarchy and indeed a threat to take the church, take England back into the Catholic Church, which comes alongside that. Louis XIV's cousin, they're all interrelated.
Right.
And I mean, there's truth in this. One account of the man in the iron mask, who was Fouquet's valet, I don't know if you know this, but if you see the movies, DiCaprio and all that,
Right.
he ends up being the twin brother of Louis XIV.
Yes. Right.
And that was Voltaire flirted with the idea, because when the man in the iron mask is moved to the Bastille in Paris, and the Secretary of War, I think it was, comes to visit him in prison, he stands, and Fouquet and the man in the iron mask is sitting.
Interesting.
Which implies that he's royal. And at this point, the legend of him having a mask soldered on his head begins to emerge because we know about him from these correspondence between the prisoner of war and the prison in Pignerol, where Fouquet is.
Yeah.
He's got a cloth mask on, and he only wears it when he's moved. And he's
interesting.
And they describe the architecture of where they're placing him. He gets there 4 years before Fouquet dies, so into Fouquet's time, and they bring him and they put him way, way, way down in the prison through all these locked doors. And it's not so he can't get out, it's so no one could ever hear anything that he says.
Yeah.
And the idea was, and I think Tom Holland, I don't know if you know him, the rest is history.
Yes.
He's super stuff. The idea was that we think we know who he is. He's Eustache Dauger, and he overheard things he was not meant to hear, and there were negotiations between Louis XIV and the King of England at the time, overtaking the Church of England back into the Catholic Church.
Yeah,
and the English, the Dutch, and there's wars going on, and so this is kind of quid pro quo. We'll give you a pension if you do this,
yes,
and so on. So the reason I say this is that it's in the context of all that commotion that Fouquet has remained a figure of interest because of the politics that are up and running over monarchy and so forth, both on the continent and in England itself, and Spain and the Netherlands at the time are the major powers.
Okay, so then let's just end here. Talk about the title. So the title comes up at it comes up really right at the end of the book. Where it's sort of sprinkled throughout. You've got references to it, but you sort of drive it home there at the end. And I might not be reading this correctly, but it does seem to suggest that one of the keys to canonical interpretation would be a particular view of providence,
right,
as understanding how these things are received. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and how that influences your reading of both these figures.
I'd be tempted to read what I wrote, but I won't do that. I'm very happy with the way I formulated it at the end. I worked very hard on that. So you're right that the term itself, predestinate, was a term of use. I'd looked up the history of the use of the term, and it comes from this idea that God has predestined us to a certain identity that we have in him. So you could write a book about yourself and it would be fine. But the book that ought to be written about Joshua will always be foreshortened if he's the author of it, because Joshua is more than your own idea about who you are. You are, Dave thinks you are, who your wife thinks you are, who God thinks you are. And in that sense, Ecclesiastes tells a story about a Solomon as God sees him, as someone who learned his lessons. And in that sense, inspiration is this kind of writing. Who wrote Ecclesiastes? We don't know. Is it about Solomon? Yes. Is it a true story about Solomon? Yes. Does it tell us something about Solomon we would be impoverished not knowing? Yes. And in that sense, a thin account of authorship is not going to get a hold of that. If you just say Solomon wrote it, that's not enough. It needs to be a grander, broader picture than that. And I got a little of that from the early church fathers who said, if we say it's by Solomon, then it's going to be limited in what God might want to tell us about who this figure is vis-a-vis our own lives of boundedness and mystery. And so that's kind of where I was going. But to the term, when Fouquet, what happens at the end of Fouquet's life is that he dies in the arms of his son, and Louis XIV had allowed his family to visit him. It's quite touching. He hasn't seen his wife in 16 years.
Wow.
And she's, he's not in good health, and he sees them, and Louis XIV says that he's going to let him out. And he's going to take the waters at, I can't remember, Aix-les-Bains or someplace like this. And so he's excited about it, and he dies suddenly. And so he's buried in Pignerol, in this little town in the Savoy in France, near Grenoble, if that helps. And his mother, who had always worried about him, she's a major figure. He had another chateau before he had Vaux-le-Vicomte, and he put her up there. I think his father had died, and it was a lavish place. He was collecting books and paintings, something very Solomon-like. He was down in Rome ransacking everything, bringing it up there. And his brother was in charge of this, and Mazarin, the cardinal, was helping him. And his mother moved into the house to be with him, and she refused to live in the bedroom that he gave her. And she lived in like a closet with a crucifix over her bed, and she prayed for him. It's like Monica, the mother of Augustine.
Right.
And when he's convicted, I mean, I have these stories in here. They're quite illuminating. He has a chaplain, and he's not going to confession. And the chaplain had he produced a translation of the Psalms of David and dedicated it to Fouquet, but wrote a warning to him about his dissolute life. And he gave it to Fouquet, and it's heartfelt. I mean, it's, you're preoccupied with all these things, but you should be preoccupied with God, and you're losing this. And he gave it to Fouquet, and Fouquet never read it, and he put it on the shelf in his vast library.
Yeah.
And when Fouquet is charged with embezzlement, they all hope he's not going to be executed, and he's not. And when he's given this lifetime sentence, his mother actually falls to her knees and thanks God and says, "You're in prison now, and when you go to prison, God has a chance to find you." I mean, it's really quite a moving story, and he does. And so, I mean, he's a compelling figure. I tried very hard with Charles Drazen, the author of the English biography. When he finished that, he tried to get a movie made, and the producer of Dangereux Liaison turned it down. And we tried very hard, because the thing is, it's a spellbinding story. You know it. So his mother asks that his body be brought back to Paris, and so they allow it. Louis XIV allows it. And they have a funeral mass for him there. I've been to the place. It's a chapel as I say, in the Marais. And she had founded an order in the spirit of Francis de Sales, Francis de Sales, and Jane Chantal from France. And they did good works in the hospital, and they were in an order, but their service was to the poor and to the sick. And it was dangerous work. And his mother invented medicines for smallpox and all that. Wow. She's really quite a figure. And when he dies, she has him brought back. They have the service. He dies like 3 months later. And he's buried therefore in this crypt with his family members. And the nuns of the order, we don't know who wrote his death notice. And that's where the word comes from. And I do need to say that. And it'd be worth reading it, but I quote it at the beginning of the book, and then I quote the whole thing at the end. It's in French, and basically it says something to this effect. Monsieur Fouquet, in his lifetime, was able to be outfitted to do great and grand works. And in that service, he offered a service to France and to the king. But over time, God wanted to make him a predestinate, and he brought him low. so that he might find God again. So the idea would be that God had a story he wanted to write about Fouquet, and that's the story of the counsels of wisdom that we read about him. That would be the story God would want to tell about Fouquet. And so it was that idea.
Yeah.
And that Ecclesiastes is the story that God would want to tell about Solomon, about Solomon's life. And just on a personal level, I'm firmly convinced about this. Our lives are hid with God in Christ. There's a mystery about the life that we're given to lead. And we are the author of our life, and in a lot of ways we're not.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
And that was the spiritual quest I was on in trying to understand this, and how authorship, to a certain extent, can get in the way of that. A kind of narrow understanding of authorship kind of is blocking that out. People are fighting over, the history of the Hebrew language or something. We're kind of missing the deeper significance.
Yeah. Well, and what a beautiful place to wrap up then, that we are not the authors of our own lives. Right. As much as we want to be or hope to be. Right. But that the authorship of our own lives ought to be a broader category and most chiefly represented by God. Well, thank you very much for this fabulous conversation about two different people from two very different centuries, different parts of the world, but whose lives converge in remarkable ways and remarkably illuminating ways. So thank you very much for producing this book. You can pick it up today at baylorpress.com. You can search for The Predestinate or Christopher Seitz and read one of his many books that he's published here with us at Baylor Press. So thank you for being with us today.
Thanks very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to Et Al, a podcast from Baylor University Press. We hope you've enjoyed today's episode. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to keep up with the latest from Et Al.